Thank you all for sharing. I'm just gonna read off a couple of the things that folks said in the chat about why they're here tonight. I see love of the valley, being resource wise, all the usual, plus our well went dry for the second time this morning. Concerned about the growth in the valley recently and the effects on our water tables. This has to be talked about and a strategy created going forward. And I see water is life. Connects to everything, healthy water, healthy people, healthy lands, healthy systems. And someone that says, I studied drought adapted plants and water retention landscapes. And somebody else says, I'm afraid I've been irrigating my pasture with too much water. So thank you folks on Zoom for chiming in. So water, climate, and drought are really important, complex, and sticky topics. I am by no means an expert on water, but you're going to hear from some people that are. Our goal tonight is to hear from some of those experts on water and drought, to ask questions, and to start an ongoing conversation on these important issues. So I'm going to give you a little preview of where we're headed tonight. I'm going to share a little bit about the local climate action plan and how it connects to water briefly. Then you'll hear from Laura Super about kind of some of the context of what brings us here tonight, and also she's going to share a couple of Methow Valley Citizens Council water videos with you all. You'll hear from John Culp about a drought framework. You'll hear from Chris Conrad about stream flow in the Methow during drought. We'll have a couple of time for questions, or a couple of questions after each of those. And then you'll hear from the Okanogan Conservation District about a new local water bank, and from the Methow Watershed Council about kind of drought planning in the future. And then we're hoping to have some time for discussion at the end, and we'll be flexible if discussion comes up in the middle or you have questions. We'll also do it as we go. Okay, that's where we're headed. Just going to share briefly about the Methow Valley Climate Action Plan, which is a community created and implemented plan with a shared vision about how we respond to climate change. This plan was released in 2019. A lot of people in this room were involved in helping to make it happen. And the plan covers both mitigation and resilience. So both how we respond to climate change and what we can do to mitigate emissions in our valley. Climate is one of the big drivers of drought and water scarcity issues, making the solutions and management that we're talking about tonight even more important. This slide has kind of a number of different pieces of the climate action plan in a nice drawing. So includes a lot of different things: economy, land and agriculture, natural systems, our built environment, how we respond to fires, all of that. And water is there's 7 goals in the plan, and water is the first goal. The goal is abundant water to sustain nature and people. And these are kind of the pieces of that water goal. Tonight we'll be talking a lot about the 4th one, adapt water planning for future conditions, and kind of some of the other ones as well: efficiently use and conserve water, increase natural man-made water storage capacity. So lots of pieces in there. We'll touch on some of them, but just wanted to give that little context of talking about this issue of water, and it kind of fits into a bigger context of how we address climate in our place here. I'm going to pass it next to Laura Super to take you from here. Thanks, Laura.
Thank you. I might get a little repetitive tonight in terms of the context, but I get to start and set the stage in the way of context. We have a complex and dynamic situation in this watershed. There's complex geology, hydrology, microclimates in all of our subwatersheds. There are layers of law, federal, state, and local regulations that guide land use, water use, and endangered species recovery that we have to consider. And there are many, many needs for water that can appear to be in competition, and we all know it's a finite resource. Many sources of the valley's water are natural processes. Main sources of the valley's water are natural processes, that being rain and snowfall. Those are subject to radical fluctuations that we know are going to get more extreme. So it's really important to get our arms around all of this and prepare ourselves to meet this future. I realize it's like a test that we need to study for, so we need to pass it. And that's why we're getting started today, and I'm so glad we're all here together tonight. I was also asked to introduce the films that were chosen this evening. Last summer, the Methow Valley Citizens Council produced a series of films called Living River, Water, Growth, and Climate in the Methow. The whole series includes a trailer and 7 short films that are 2.5 minutes or less. You can access them on the link above or at the screen there. The series features local knowledge holders and experts speaking about why the Methow River is unique, what threatens it, and why we need to come together to protect the river. We're just showing 2 of these short films tonight from climatologist Amy Snover and longtime resident and Methow Watershed Council member and rock star Greg Knott. So I hope you enjoy them and look up the rest of the films when you get a chance. Thank you.
I'm Amy Snover, and I run the Climate Impacts Group at the University of Washington. Our team does the research to understand why climate matters to our region. The water in all its forms, snowpack, rain, rivers, lakes, streams, is integral to the valley. And anything you love about this place, you can trace it back to water. The challenge that we're facing is that climate change is going to disrupt that water cycle. Climate change with warming means less snow in the winter and more rain. So that means less storage of water in our mountain reservoirs. So people always ask me, is there anything we can do about this? Yes, we can stop and slow climate change, because until we do that, until we reduce our emissions, it's going to get warmer forever. We also need to prepare for the changes that are underway. We know that some changes in our snowpack and stream flow and water are going to come, and we all need to prepare for them. We can do that by coming together as a community. Since water touches us all, we all touch water. So the fate of our watershed is not yet written, and there's still time to come together, take action, and move forward as a community to create the future that we all want to have.
Hi, I'm Greg Knott. I'm your neighbor. I live up the Chewuk about 8 miles. I've lived in the Methow for about 40 years. I've been a member of the Methow Watershed Council for 22 years. The mission of the Watershed Council is we would like to provide adequate water between 3 shared resources. That's water for the fish in stream, water for the farmers, and also water for towns. The Methow Basin is what would be called a connected basin in this sense. If you look at the valley as a bathtub full of big rocks, that's what we're sitting on. And what that means is it creates an aquifer, or a level of water underneath the ground, that is constantly in motion. It flows down parallel to the river. There's a river underground paralleling the river you see above ground. And every straw you put in the aquifer in terms of a well, or everything you put on top of the aquifer in terms of a septic system, goes into that underground river that flows by us every day. So that creates a situation where we have to be extremely mindful of what we take out and what we put back, because from valley wall to valley wall, it's basically all the same water. What are we going to do about droughts? They are coming as the highs get higher and the lows get lower. What we're going to do is our best to manage drought. We can't control it, but we can manage it. And an action plan that addresses who is going to curtail their water use during periods of low water, and how they're going to be compensated, and how the rest of the folks are going to conserve what they have left, are important questions that as a community we need to address now.
So I think we're ready to introduce John Cope. John will be speaking to us tonight about the Washington State Drought Framework, what happens when a drought emergency is declared, what causes it to be declared, and other things related to that. John here is he's the Water Resources Program Manager for the Washington State Conservation Commission. He's been working in water resource conservation for over 23 years. Beginning with the Okanogan Conservation District, he facilitated drought response through the commission to conservation districts during 4 separate emergency declarations. So he has a lot of experience in this space. John serves as a technical advisor and liaison for conservation in the state agency drought response family. So welcome, John. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. All right, there's a little pop-up here. I don't need to mess with this. You know?
Nope, I'll have to clear that.
Okay.
Yeah.
And will you be forwarding?
Yeah, I'll
slides?
go just,
Okay. But will you be forwarding them or do you?
I can,
Okay, all right. So thank you. That 23 years ago, when I started working in water resource conservation, I was working for Craig Nelson over here. So the fun we had back in the day. So, but we still get to work together, just a little bit differently now. So, so the State Conservation Commission is an oversight agency. We work with and alongside conservation districts, all 45 of them in the state, and so Okanogan is just one piece of our state puzzle. And it, you know, Okanogan County, resting here on the east slopes of the Cascades, has always had water resource concerns. And so we're just part of the system that have been working on conserving that resource. So yeah, drought framework. I didn't put the word emergency in here, and I should have. And so in the introduction, you know, we have a lot more drought than what you hear about through at the state level, because what we're actually talking about when we say a drought was declared is exclusively an emergency, a state emergency.
John, I want to pause you for a second. Can you go in the back here?
I just got the
Okay.
so yeah, perfect. So yeah, so it's a state of emergency, right? So it's essentially the slowest natural disaster that we deal with oftentimes. And so it's hard to get people, you know, too wrapped around the axle about calling it an emergency. I just realized there's an issue with my slide.
We all did a minute ago.
Yeah. Okay. So maybe I should have started with a caveat that this is Jeff Marty, who's he works for Ecology, fantastic guy, and he's the state drought coordinator. So he is Mr. Drought in Washington State, but he was unavailable, and so you're listening to second string here or third. So, but anyway, so we'll blame Jeff for the for the slides, but you get the drift here. So, and so the trigger to the drought emergency in Washington State is a function of state law and Washington administrative code. And so I could have probably just left this poster on the wall and said, here's the drought trigger. And but I have some other things. I would like people to at least understand how we get to these things. And so the drought trigger has actual two triggers involved in it. The first one is around water supply. And so the way the law sets out that first trigger that has to be met is 75% of normal water supply. And by that, they're typically running off a median rolling 30-year median for what normal water supply is. And so that is data driven. That's a pretty easy box to check. We either have it or we don't. And so a lot goes into that. It's not super simple, but it's data driven. The second trigger is hardship. And so, and what I mean by that is there are water users in the state, whether it's people or fish or whatever, all kinds of uses and users. And so if the lack of normal water supply creates a hardship for somebody, that is the second trigger. And so, so you can imagine all of the conversation that goes into about, because that's the law is about that vague. It doesn't identify, well, what do you mean by hardship? How much hardship? How much does it have to hurt? And so, so as we march into a dry season or a dry water year, that one actually kind of holds up an emergency declaration more than anything else. We can collect the data super quick with modern technology. There are all kinds of sensors and things, and a lot of people, mostly at the federal government, federal level, who feed us data that allow us to get to the supply. And then the hardship, now you have, it's human based. It's, your heart factors into it, economics factor into it. Believe it or not, the municipal water systems of Everett, Seattle, and Tacoma factor into the statewide conversations here, because if they can serve, they lose revenue. And so, so anyway, that's the hard part. But in a nutshell, and a great graphic, those things need to be met for us to get to a drought emergency. So I'll go in just a little bit more depth. If we could look at the next slide. Oh. There we go. Okay, so RCW 4383B, that is the drought portion of the state statute. And so you can see here that it tries to give some guidance about the thing about the 75% water supply. It doesn't have to be the whole state, because oftentimes we will have places that have and places that have not, depending on how the weather rolls in. And we have had different types of droughts, snowpack droughts, temperature drought over the last 20 years. And so so it adds this geographic outline question. It could be a sub-watershed, it could be a county, it could be a region of the state, something that you can kind of draw a line around and isolate with data to say, this is what we can declare a drought emergency in Okanogan County, because they're the only ones that meet both of those drought triggers. And so, and then of course, the median thing is down there in the 30-year period. So we've got some sideboards to look at to measure against if anybody comes and says, no, you're jumping the gun, or you're moving forward too fast. We've got some things to look at to drive that. All right, and so here's part of the administrative code that And for those of you who aren't familiar with the fun intricacies of state law and rule, usually the administrative code is just like adding some clarity to the statute that it pertains to. And so, so this further talks about seasonality and what do we mean by normal water supply. So go ahead. Okay, so in this slide, this one's not mine, the font's way too small, 28 or bigger. But anyway, so this first box, it's kind of olive drab, I guess, says ecology convenes the WSAC, WSAC. That stands for Water Supply Availability Committee. And it's a little misleading because the Water Supply Availability Committee meets every month, regardless of what water supply is doing. So we're constantly meeting, and I'll explain who makes that up here in just a minute. And then the WSAC makes recommendations on water supply. So obviously that's only if we don't have enough water supply. They pass on the hey, alert, we've got an issue here. 2, this one says the EWEC makes determination about hardship. And so that's EWEC. We love our acronyms at the state, of course, it's government. So, and that is the Executive Water Emergency Committee. And I'll get into the makeup of that too, but passing it up the chain, they get paid more than the WSAC folks do, but anyway. And then after the executive committee looks at it and weighs the data, and feels like the burdens have been met, the 2 triggers have been met, before there's a recommendation for the emergency, they pass it to any of the tribes in the geographic area that's been outlined, as a consultation, a courtesy. It's a way to gather more information, but also express the intention. And typically at that point too, they start kind of creating pathways for either funding or technical assistance that the tribe might identify. Once they've done that and gotten all the conversations out of the way, then it goes to the governor's office. And the governor isn't actually the one that declares the drought emergency, but you can't declare the drought emergency without their approval. So the governor has to approve of the emergency, and then actually the director of the Department of Ecology is the one who makes the formal drought emergency declaration, and that's Laura Watson at present. So next slide, please. All right, this is my slide. So the text is a little bit better, and I think it's more fun. But so this is the WSAC that I mentioned, and so you can see, ecology is a state agency, and the Office of the Washington State Climatologist, that's at University of Washington, and that's a state agency. But the rest of these people, USGS, National Weather Service, NRCS, Bureau of Rec, Army Corps, and Bonneville are all federal entities, but they're all federal entities that look at some aspect of water supply. And so they're all constantly, they all have great websites typically. Some of them are a little hard to navigate to collect the data, but so once a month we have a 3-hour meeting, and all of these folks give a PowerPoint presentation via Zoom, and we get the data. And they also kind of point out, hey, you might pay special attention to these places, but that's the WSAC. Okay, next slide. And so where do conservation district, why am I on, you saw I wasn't a formal member of WSAC, but to get to hardship, that's not data driven, right? That's what's happening out across the landscape. And so as I mentioned in my intro, we have 45 conservation districts in the state. They don't touch every inch because cities can opt out, but they touch a lot of this state. They cover most of it. And so so I act as the liaison, which was mentioned earlier. I reach out to districts in those geographically determined areas, and we start a conversation ongoing about what are you hearing? What are you seeing in your neighborhood? Are things drying up? Is anybody coming in saying, hey, my well went dry, I need some help? And so we start gathering that data on hardship. After the WASAC has said we're getting close, but before the EWEC meets, there's a whole conversation that's ongoing where we collect our data. So, all right. So this is the Executive Water Emergency Committee.
Hopefully not.
It's actually a picture of the very first city council and mayor for the city of Okanogan. So. No, it's, yep, that is 8. Yeah, 7 council members, 1 mayor. So anyway, so the executive, so you'll look at those, they're all state agencies. And so the way the law outlines it, actually, I think that one's in WAC. It's all of the state agencies that have some, they touch water in some way. Ecology is the only one that has that regulatory function for water, but all of these other ones have some interest in water, but it's their executive directors or an appointee, and so that's why it's an executive committee. Next slide, please. Okay, so in legislation here, I think it was 2 years ago, we added this. So this was if for those of you who've memorized the drought contingency plan that was just passed in recent years, we added this advisory stage so that we could formally get information and education out. It doesn't really authorize anything other than, and it serves as a function like, hey, we see the train wreck coming and we want to make sure nobody's sitting on the tracks. And so, so this is a formal, so we don't necessarily need the emergency. We just need to it's coming. And so, yeah, drought conditions may develop. So it's pretty vague too, but, and we have used that this last declaration. And then of course the emergency. And so it exists or is forecast to occur. So so it's pretty close. It leaves a little wiggle room there, but anyway, so please, next slide. All right, so one of the provisions in law is that you can't declare a drought emergency indefinitely. There has to be an end date. And so, so we had to talk about, you know, how do we extend if you know, because multi-year droughts are not unheard of. Ask California and Oregon. But, and so we did use the extension on the last formal drought declaration. And so it's a useful tool. Doesn't seem like you need to have a formal process, but we do. And so I just thought we'd mention it. Go ahead, please. Yeah, sorry. So just pointing to some of the data. How am I doing on time? Am I like rambling way over? Am I okay?
I said like 5 more minutes.
Okay,
Yeah.
all right, perfect. Okay, so the rest of the slides are really just about kind of showing you where we look under the hood. And so one of the things that the statute allows if there's an emergency, and only if there's an emergency declared, is these supplemental emergency drought wells, essentially. So they so you can drill a well that just sits there, and if your surface water source, let's say, is vulnerable to drought, you pull water out of a Beaver Creek, let's say, and the last droughts that have affected this area, Beaver Creek goes dry, but you have gotten a right through ecology to have one of these drought wells, then if a drought gets declared, then you can go to ecology and request to use that. And maybe one of the ecology staff in the back will correct me later afterwards, hopefully, but essentially that's how it works. There's a system of wells out there that only can turn on during a drought, under a drought declaration. However, over the 4 different drought emergencies that I have helped the state work its way through, it seems like every year the number of people requesting to turn on their well has gotten smaller and smaller. I'd like to think that it's because they're planning and becoming more resilient and relying less on these as a backup and more on drought resiliency strategies. So anyway, next slide, please. And then, so I just wanted to show this was in 2021, the drought, just to illustrate the geographic area and to illustrate, and this is of course my opinion and does not represent that of the commission or districts or ecology, the cities of Everett, Seattle, and Tacoma, and this area that did not get included in what essentially I think, so they also have some reservoirs that allow them to be more resilient than their rain driven or rain dependent basins. And so they were able to fill their reservoirs and not suffer hardship, but it truly was kind of politics that allowed that little island to stay out. It would have in the past just been a statewide drought. So anyway, this just shows kind of some of the data stuff that we look at in those presentations, stream flow forecasting, all of the gauging stations that show green is good, yellow and brown get worse. Blue is really good, I believe. And then percentage of normal precipitation. So they have all kinds of ways to put graphic out there. I like these big maps with colors. It's pretty easy to see. I think this is the dry spot. and you know, so anyway, it's nice. Most of the color coordination is similar between the agencies and data sets. So next slide. And then, so this is actually a Jeff Marty tool, and so and not one that you'll find on any website, but it's a probability graph. Yeah. Anyway, and so it at a certain date, he will run the numbers because that's how smart that guy is, and I can barely even understand the output, but run the numbers on the probability that if from that date forward in the water year, we get normal precipitation, the probability of getting getting back to a non-declarable drought situation. So, which obviously in the water year, the later you are in the water year, most of the time, the less water you're going to get from Mother Nature. And so, so the probability the farther you go ramps up quicker. So anyway, this east slope of the Cascades, obviously, the probability was not that great. So go ahead. So that was just a tool that we use at the state level. And then, so that state recommendation, when we go to, first, when we go from WASAC to EWEC, so that we can, the executive directors aren't watching this stuff as it goes along. So we have to also use color and whatnot. But, and so this actually was a declaration map where we were talking about extending. And so the staff recommendation was to extend the red areas because they were not recovering, and the hardship in those areas was severe. And then the rest of these let the drought expire. And so, but we can also use maps like this when we go to determine, is it advisory or is it drought? And so, so this one, it's done out by county, the lines, but you can also see the numbers, and that's water resource inventory area numbers. So you guys are right here, 48. So anyway, next slide, please. I'm not going to read this to you, and not even leave it up to be read completely, but it's just kind of an example of the considerations that we use for recommendations. And so it's a constant conversation. Next slide. Okay, so this is a National Drought Monitor. You can find this if you just Google National Drought Monitor. It'll first start at the United States, but you can click your way first to the west, I think, or Pacific Northwest, and then down to Washington State. And again, with the colors. And so this is actually not this week, but last week. They actually didn't update it. So it's The data was from the February 28th, and then it was released every Thursday. Typically, last Thursday didn't happen, but every Thursday, it was, yeah, anyway, whatever. You can go on there and the new map for the week will be up. And so, it's basically a scale that the federal government uses. D0 is yellow. If it's white, then you're in, some realm of normal water supply. This is a federal tool, and we don't use this for the state determinations, but we look at it, and it is kind of an indicator. But the federal drought monitor uses soil moisture, and the state doesn't in our declarations. And so that's why, even now, and this week's actually, I looked at it, it was just after I had to send my slide deck. So it didn't change that much. So despite the fact that I saw the numbers were at 103% was that snow water equivalent? Mazama. But look here, this western half of Okanogan County, right here, we're in abnormally dry conditions. And so that doesn't really make sense that we would have 103% of snow water equivalent and be abnormally dry. And so in my discussions, the reason for that is soil moisture. So it's not showing, if you looked at the stream flow stuff, or you looked at all of the other indicators, the climatology stuff, it wouldn't show this. But because I think I'm not a climate guy, I'm not a hydrogeologist, I'm not even a scientist or a hard science guy, but I think we got the snow so early this year, and which normally would fall as rain and fill up the soil profile with water before the snows come. We didn't get that. And so the soil moisture is dry underneath the snow. And so, so this is accounting for the fact that when the snow starts, well, not when it starts to melt, but when the snow melts, some of the moisture that's held up there, some of the 103% is gonna stay up there it's gonna fill up the soil profile. So some of that will still then come down, but so there's a deficit against the 103 already that exists out there, and that's what this map picks up. So next slide. Okay, so I just put up this cartoon. So I apologize about my entry slide and my finishing slide. They weren't meant to be, look, the sky is falling, but this is actually from Winthrop Dam when they had the drought down, and they're trying to figure out how to get these irrigation intakes into the water, which was farther down. So, but anyway, this says the drought is really doing a number on your hay field, and this guy says this is corn. Anyway, do we have time for one or two?
I think one or two questions. People have them now, and then we want to get it out.
Yes.
I just want to confirm the drought declaration is basically based on the runoff from surface water sources. It's not related to like recharge and declining groundwater levels because of drought. Like just the trigger to 75% was on the.
Well, it's yes and no. We don't use groundwater as a trigger. So typically it's, the first thing that we can look at is what falls out of the sky. NRCS has their snow tell sites, so they can tell how much water is in that snow. And then you kind of relative, speculate how much in other places, but excuse me. But and runoff isn't a very good indicator. So like I said, all of those people in the WASAC provide a different sliver of data.
Right.
So we do look at all kinds of things to make the determination.
And it's just to follow up, if the declaration is declared, the resources are people can go to an emergency like drought groundwater roll.
If you have one already,
Right.
you can apply to have it turned.
And then I just wonder, like those people that have those wells, what's to stop them from using it when it's not like the drought? Is there any?
Well, it would be illegal, so
Yeah.
the same thing that stops people from not exceeding the speed limit. So it's,
You mentioned that hardship is difficult to declare or difficult to determine. Is there an example where local communities are working with the conservation district or the commission at the state level to help you determine those hardships?
yeah, and in fact, sometimes the state will even receive a letter from county commissioners or, so it's one of those things because it is human derived information and decision. The more, the better story you can tell more often, the more likely you will be to elevate it to that level. So yeah, if we're heading that way and I call Craig and he's like, well, I haven't heard anything. If Craig reaches out to the Watershed Council or irrigation districts or, all these other people who's focused on these kinds of things, and then get the information back to Craig. Craig sends it to me, and then at these meetings, then I can lift from all across the state. Or yes.
So there's sort of an impression, which I think is the wrong impression, that the one action you do in a drought emergency is to allow access to the drought wells. It seems to me there's a lot more that you do.
There absolutely is. That is the one that the law allows to happen. That one, you can't use those wells any other time. And so there is a lot of other response, but that wasn't my presentation today. So to get there, yeah. Then also Craig has the opportunity to reach back out and start working with his local folks. So we probably better save the rest of the questions. Put a pin in it, please. I'm not leaving. I will be here even after we shut things down. So if you have questions, yeah, please save. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Craig.
You're dragging me out of retirement? Oh, you want me to introduce? Here's my good friend and ex-colleague, Chris Conrad from the USGS. He's worked in the Methow Valley now. I think the first time you engaged him maybe 20 some odd years ago.
Yeah.
Yeah, you've written a number of papers on the hydrogeology, even though you're not quite a hydrogeologist as I understand it. And you have a place here.
Yep.
An avid skier and an excellent presenter. So I give you Chris Conrad.
Thank you. Just give me a second here.
Yeah, really. They're going to save us.
There are some additional chairs up here. If anyone that's standing up and back wants to sit down. I can share it. I see what happened. Just increasing anticipation.
Excellent. Super. Sorry about that, everybody. Thanks for coming here this evening. I'm going to talk about hydrologic aspects of drought, so stream flow, precip, and I think it'll be a nice compliment to what John was just going through. I'll note that before I became a hydrologist, I did work in environmental policy and found it way too complicated. So I think the science is like, mass balance and pretty simple. Okay, let me just get some here. Oh, well. Okay, so what is drought? So John's going through kind of a state drought declaration. It's a very specific thing. There's some criteria, but when we talk about drought, often we are talking about many different possible things. And so tonight, I'm going to talk about different types of droughts and different ways people talk about drought. And there's not a right or a wrong way, but I do think it's really important that when we are talking about drought, we understand what each other is talking about. So the term drought is used to talk about lack of precipitation or snow, talk about hot temperatures, situations where you have little soil moisture, water stressed plants, low stream flow and groundwater levels, times maybe when we need to irrigate to make up for soil moisture, or actually administrative declaration. So these are all droughts. And when we're talking about drought, a lot of times we are talking about both causes and effects, or causes or effects. So it's just good to be clear about where we are, thinking about drought. This diagram is not supposed to explain drought, but it is supposed to provide kind of a roadmap of when we are talking about a specific aspect of drought, where do we fit in kind of with the big picture. So we can kind of start up here with a lack of rain or snow, too warm or windy conditions. We know either of those lead to a whole host of consequences. So less snowpack, low soil moisture, less recharge, less groundwater, less stream flow, water stress vegetation. And we can even see things like wildfire, poor air quality coming out, less water for people, less water for river and for businesses. So these are all different aspects of drought. I'll be talking mostly about the hydrology side of things. So really, I'll be talking about kind of this part of the diagram right up here. And folks should ask questions as I go along. There's going to be a bunch of slides with graphs. I'll do my best to explain why we are looking at a graph, because I know that a lot of people don't like to look at graphs. So if I don't do a good job of that, just say, hey, why are we looking at this? So what are the types of droughts here? There are a number of different types of droughts. So we can talk about annual droughts. So those would be years where we have lower than normal precipitation. We can also talk about a seasonal drought. And that's something that we have pretty much every summer. Low snowpack in winter and spring, we often refer to as a snow drought. And then we can have consecutive dry years, which John mentioned, in interannual drought. And those are really severe, because that's when we see both stream flow affected, also groundwater, and it's really hard on plants and animals and people. So I think that's something worth paying attention to. So let's start with annual droughts. Annual drought, again, is a year when precipitation is below normal. And this plot over here shows annual precipitation at Harts Pass and Winthrop in inches. So you can see Harts Pass is obviously a lot wetter than Winthrop. And we have years from 1982 to 2002. And I'll note that this scale here, it's a log scale. And that's because if we plotted this on just a regular linear scale, we'd really just see Harts Pass, and then we just see like a little line down here with Winthrop. With a log scale, the variability is essentially percent. So if we compare Harts Pass to Winthrop, what we see is that the percent variability is a lot higher in Winthrop than at Harts Pass. Even though the absolute kind of variability is greater at Harts Pass. So year to year precipitation varies more in the mountains in terms of inches, but in terms of percent, it varies more in the valley. And generally in drier places, it's gonna vary more. An important thing here is to compare annual precipitation, in this case at Harts Pass, and again, annual precipitation to Winthrop. And if you can see a relationship here, let me know, because I don't see it. And so this is really important, because what this means is that when Winthrop is having a drought, an annual drought, so that would be years below average, it's not necessarily going to be below average precip at Harts Pass. And likewise, when Harts Pass has low precip, so that would be the years in here, Winthrop might not be having a low year. And so drought varies. John showed that great map of the state, how drought varies across the state. But even if we just look in this basin, drought varies from place to place. So it varies with elevation, and it also varies, east to west. And so you might be talking with other people in the valley, and they'll be like, "Isn't it dry?" And you'd be like, "No, it's not." If you're a skier, you're more concerned maybe with this. If you're farming, you might be more concerned with this. Wait. Okay, so that was annual droughts. So that's a year when we have below normal precip, and greatly below normal precip is going to be an extreme drought. Seasonal droughts are also really important. So every June through October is pretty dry around here. This plot here shows mean monthly precipitation. So what we do is we take precipitation, say for Harts Pass, for every October in Harts Pass, we calculate a mean value, and do the same thing for November, December, January, February, and on. So it's a mean monthly precip. And then we can do that for Salmon Meadows, where we also have data, and then for Winthrop. And you can see that all of these places are drier in the summer, especially the variability. So the seasonal drought is especially strong in the mountains because they get so much precipitation during the winter. So a lot of seasonal variability in the mountains. And then pretty much by April, we've gotten most of the precipitation that we see for the year. That doesn't mean that precipitation after April isn't important. It is very important because that's during the growing season. It's just not, there's not going to be a lot of volume at that point. Yeah, and so so I think it's useful to, when we talk about, when we think about drought, just remember that, yeah, every year we pretty much see some sort of a drought, and it's pretty predictable.
So I have a,
Yeah.
Excuse this question.
No, please.
There can be 120% of normal in the mountains,
Yep.
and twist can be in drought.
Yeah.
And that is because, that happens because,
So there's a couple of reasons, but typically that's because of the way the precipitation is falling, right? So we got a lot of snow up in the mountains, and temperatures are a little bit warm. We'll still get snowpack up in the mountains accumulating, but down twist, it'll either we won't be getting rain, or well, when it does fall, it just evaporates. Yeah. And so, yes, it's just an elevation. You see year to year, there's going to be big differences in terms of elevation. It's not like everywhere from the valley up into the mountains is 120% or 80%. It's like, yeah, there's going to be these elevation bands where just because of the way the storms hit, and also the way snow melts. Yeah, you see a lot of variability.
So is there a percentage of moisture in the valley that is directly attributable to the amount of snowpack in the mountains?
No. So the stream flow in the rivers is going to be driven by the snowpack in the mountains primarily, but in the valley itself, the local snowpack, the snowpack that's in the valley, is going to be important for soil moisture, as well as another really big important factor is just how much spring precip we get. So do we get rain in the spring? How hot and windy is it? Because the other part of this kind of water balance is you get inputs from precip, but then you have evaporation, and wind and temperature drive that.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so here we can do a comparison of annual to seasonal drought. So I explained that we have this predictable kind of seasonal drought, and then annual droughts are basically years when we have low annual precipitation. So this plot here is just for Hart's Pass. We have the annual precip for Hart's Pass, and then for each year, so for each year we have the seasonal precip. So fall and winter are the purple and the blue, spring and summer are the green and the yellow. So each year has 4 symbols attached to it, and they'd all kind of line up here. So this would be a wet year, and you can see, most of the precipitation came in winter, but also a fair amount came in fall. Quite a bit less in the spring, and then quite a bit less in the summer. This again, log scale, and that's just so that we can see all these seasons. If we didn't do a log scale here, basically we would just see fall and winter precip, and spring and summer precip would just look like nothing down here. The main point here is that we can see a lot of seasonal variability regardless of what the annual precip is. And so when we are in say a annual drought, and we have a low precip in a given year, it's mostly going to be because of winter and fall precip, and then spring and summer precip can kind of be more or less all over the place. There's not a good relationship between spring and summer precip and annual precip, whereas fall and winter precip you can kind of see generally just increase with annual precip. So fall and winter really drive our annual patterns. And then even if we have a dry annual, a dry year, we can still get a fair amount of spring or summer precipitation, which can be really important for hardship and effects. So that's kind of, going back to John's presentation, it's just important that we don't just say, oh, well, because it was a dry year, we're going to get a lot of, we're going to have a really hard time, or we're going to have a lot of hardship, a lot of effects. Well, it really does depend on what happens in the spring and summer as well. Okay, so if annual precip is low, are we going to have low summer stream flow? That's probably something that we're pretty interested in. And so if we look at this plot over here, we again have Hart's Pass precipitation, because that's a pretty good indicator of how much overall stream flow there's going to be in the river. And then on this axis, we're just looking at the minimum summer stream flow. And you can see, there's a bit of a relationship here that generally in wetter years, when there's good snowpack, a lot of snow in the mountains, we're going to get higher low flows in the summer. But there's quite a bit of scatter, so a lot of stuff can still happen, and that stuff is the timing of snow melt, it's late summer storms, recent wildfire, which affects runoff, the amount of runoff that you get for a given amount of precip, and then also previous year precipitation. So there is carryover storage in the groundwater that can make up for either precipitation deficits, in a given year. So this makes it complicated for John, because we probably have a good idea of this by April 1st, but that's not going to necessarily tell us whether or not we're going to see really low flows in summer. So that's why this stuff's really complicated and unpredictable. This just shows minimum stream flow. So it's the same value as over here near Pateros, where USGS operates a gauge there. And then just year, just to give you a sense of kind of variability and how things move around. And then these are the most recent years. And you can see, recently we haven't been seeing really extreme low flows, or at least not a lot of really extreme low flows. And if we look over here, it seems like these recent years, the low flows are fairly high for the amount of precip in those years. Why that may be occurring, I don't know. We would expect that if snowpack is coming off faster because of climate change, we would expect the opposite. We'd actually expect to see that for a year with, say, 60 inches of precip at Hart's Pass, we'd expect this blue dot to be lower. There have been some recent changes in water management that could be underlying this. So getting off of river for surface water diversions and moving over to groundwater, that may be a fact going on here. It's not entirely clear to me what's going on. So let's compare stream flow in a dry year compared to a wet year. And for this, we're going to use some hydrographs from Andrews Creek. It's a nice basin because we don't have any human influences up there. Pretty representative of at least the eastern part of the basin and higher up. So in dry years, we generally have less snowpack and warmer temperatures. And this orange line here shows the hydrograph for Andrews Creek for 2015, which was a dry year. You can see runoff is earlier in the year, and stream flow can actually be higher in the spring and in the winter because, in particular, because of warm temperatures, you get runoff that in a cold year, all the water will be just locked up in the snowpack. And so this is why it's a little deceiving to, so 2015 was a drought year, but in fact, stream flow was higher during the spring than in a fairly wet year, in this case, 2011 for Andrews Creek. This plot down here is same data. It's just, again, using a log scale so that we can get a better idea of what's going on during this low period. So you can kind of see, there's a lot of noise here going on, but in any event, you can see that there was like a runoff event in November in 2015. In 2011, really, there wasn't much going on at all until, after April when snow started to melt. And you can also see that the majority of the runoff is coming earlier in the year during this dry year than in a wet year. One other thing I'll note is that you notice even though two very different years, the slope of this line is pretty similar. So these two lines have about the same slope. And because it's a log plot, what that slope is indicating is basically the percent change in stream flow every day. And so the nice thing about that is if we can characterize that rate, then we can actually predict what low flow is once we kind of get past the peak of snowmelt in any year, because it's often pretty consistent in a basin. It won't be the same for Andrews, say, as might be pretty similar for the Chihuahua, but it's not the same for the Methow. So you have to do that type of analysis for individual sites to really use that. So I'm going to talk about two more types of drought. Snow drought. So generally droughts in the Methow are snow droughts because that's where most of the water is stored. Snow droughts can either be caused by low precipitation or by warm temperatures. So we can get normal precip, but the precip is falling as rain, and so we never build up snowpack. This plot here is again for Hart's Pass, and it's just comparing, it's going to be hard to see it, but it's comparing snow water equivalent on June 1st compared to precip for the year. And snow droughts would be basically times when the snow water equivalent is quite a bit lower than the precip, just to give you an example there. This is showing a plot of snow water equivalent on June 1st, again at Hart's Pass, and then that minimum stream flow, summer stream flow near Pateros. Again, there's a weak relationship here, but there's a lot of other stuff going on. So we can't just say based on snowpack in June, what are our low flows going to look like during the summer? So the last kind of drought I'd like to talk about is interannual drought. I think this is one that we should really pay attention to, because this can be really, when we get into some really big problems with wells running dry, really low stream flows, stressed out vegetation. And so interannual droughts are basically consecutive years where we have below normal precip. I think really the last time we saw kind of a really pretty significant period of interannual drought was right around here, centered right around 2001. In recent years, we've had below, a fair number of below average years, but they haven't been really below average. And this is the difference between, for Hart's Pass, the difference between the annual precip and mean precipitation. So this line right here would be mean precip, and then if you're above the line, you're above normal. If you're below the line, you're below normal for that year.
Chris, is that mean precip in Winthrop?
No, this is Hart's Pass. Sorry. Yeah, I generally will use Hart's Pass just because it's the best indicator of stream flow, kind of water availability. When again, you get a different story if you look at Winthrop. It's just that Winthrop's not going to be telling you much about stream flow in the rivers. So summary, drought's a general term. It refers to both the climate forcing of things like low precip, low snowpack, high temperatures. It also refers to effects on people, the landscape, and rivers. We really do need to be clear when we're talking to each other, when we're about drought, what we're talking about. And it's fine to talk about any of those. That's all kind of within the realm of what drought is. Droughts range from seasons, predictably, to multiple years, probably most problematically, and they're very localized in different parts of the basin. The effects of droughts on stream flow in particular depend on many factors. So particularly the amount, timing, and form of precip. Droughts don't have a single definition and can be unpredictable as a result, which makes drought management challenging. So with that, I'll open up for questions. Yeah.
So you made two statements with two graphs that appear to me, I must be misunderstanding, to be contradictory. You said that snowpack doesn't predict minimum stream flow, but you also said that once the stream flow starts to drop, you can then predict where the minimum is going to be because of the rate of drop is consistent.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to understand those two.
Sure. Yeah. So let's see. Let me go back to this plot.
Yeah, so that one I understand.
Okay. Yeah. So this one, what I was saying is once we're past the kind of the peak of snow melt, then we're going to usually see a fairly consistent decrease in stream flow as a % per day. And so we can use that to then actually predict what stream flow is. But we're not going to be able to do that until we're really out into June and early July. And typically when we're measuring snowpack, we're often looking at April 1st as the point of maximum accumulation. Yep.
Obviously, all of these are based on past data and averages and this and that.
Yep.
Are you seeing changes in that data with climate change? And what are you using to forecast what might be, for instance, the 30-year average? I assume that changes somewhat, and is that getting lower, or how does this all fit into where we're going in the future?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I would say there's a lot of uncertainty. We know that there have been some recent changes in terms of the timing of runoff in the basin, where it's getting earlier. The challenge with that, though, is that we also see, and I think I showed this here, we also see that the timing of runoff is earlier in dry years. So it's not entirely clear if the change in the timing of runoff is because of, we don't know, we can't really untangle that from just the amount of runoff in a given year. As far as kind of what's going to happen over the next 30 years, I mean, I think we can just assume we're going to see, this kind of variability. And I think it's useful, even though the past isn't going to predict the future. I think the past is probably in some ways some of the best information we have about what the future might bring. It's going to be really unlikely that we would see interannual drought a whole lot worse than this, but we could. But this at least gives us a sense of like, oh, we could get 4 years where we have about a 20-inch deficit every year. So that's an 80-inch deficit over 4 years. That's pretty significant. So that at least gives us some kind of sideboards to think about management. Yep.
Relative to that question, what is the period of measurement that's available? How long we had a snow tail and North Pass? How long we had stream gauges in the Methow?
So
answered her question with that data.
Yeah, that's a really good question. We the SNOTEL information goes back to the early 80s. I know the weather station at Winthrop goes back, I think, to the 60s. The gauge at Pateros goes back to the early part of the century. Most of the other stream gauges in the basin are more recent, and a number of them were installed in the 90s with in-stream flow rules. So we have limited information about kind of long-term trends and variability.
I think unfortunately we're gonna have to pause questions there. Thank you so
Okay.
much,
Sure thing.
Chris.
We have a couple more speakers if you guys are interested.
No, I can announce. Okay, so thank you. I know a ton of information. We've got next up, we're gonna hear from water banking. Gonna go first. Is that right? Yeah. Okay. Cool. So Craig Nelson from the Okanogan Conservation District is gonna talk about a water banking project. We heard about the drought piece. We're gonna talk some about solutions now. So shifting gears a little bit. Go ahead.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, so a couple of things. Just want to give a little bit of a background about the Conservation District. We've been mentioned a few times. And from John, usually, it's very positive. Thank you, John. I appreciate that. I'll pay you in beer later. So the Conservation District's been around Okanogan County since 1940. Conservation districts were created back in the Dust Bowl era across the United States as a response to the Dust Bowl. So our roots, if you will, are in soil conservation, but we have worked in many, many realms of natural resources and conservation. We are local government. We are non-regulatory, which is what allows us to kind of walk up to local landowners and not get cussed at or yelled at or anything like that, which is really nice. It makes easier to sleep at night, if you will. So we have kind of 6 program areas for our conservation district, and the work that we do is based off of what folks like you come to us and say we need help with this stuff. So one of the things that we work in is water. So we work in water quality and water conservation programs, and so there's several others. There's habitat restoration, there's wildfire preparedness and recovery. You might hear a lot about that kind of stuff. Agricultural conservation. So that's where some of the water and our other programs side of agriculture kind of intermix. Particularly with irrigation efficiency type programs, and then also just other general ag conservation programs. And finally, education. We do a lot of work with schools, school gardens, in-classroom education programs and things like that. So next slide. I'm going to help you make up a lot of time. So anyways, so a lot of talk has been about the SNOTEL sites. So in the back there, I brought these. These just came out today. They are literally hot off the press. The most recent snow survey reports, and I specifically say snow survey because this includes snow tell information as well as snow course information. So U.S. Department of Agricultural Natural Resources Conservation Service, big mouthful, otherwise known as NRCS. They're kind of the federal equivalent to us. They go out and they measure that, which is this is our natural water bank, right? So they go out once a month, January, February, March, yeah, just those 3 months, I think. And they do manual snow course measurements. They go out with a metal tube and they measure the depth of the snow and they weigh that snow, and that tells them how much water is in that depth of snow. Because as we all know, you might have this much snow, but it's really dry powder stuff. It's great to ski in. It's terrible for a snowball fight, and that's the water equivalent, okay? And so they measure those things at snow tell sites to kind of compare these electronic machines. Are they telling us what we think they're telling us, or is it maybe a little bit different? They can kind of correct some of that data, but they also measure at other sites that don't have snow tell stations. Snow tells are very expensive to put in and of course maintain. And so they do these sites, and this information then is put in. This creates those 30-year averages. And the snow tell sites have only been around for a few decades. Some of these snow courses have been around since back in the 50s. So there is a longer record for some of those sites. Some snow course sites get retired because they feel that information, they can get accurate enough information from other sources. But that is where some of that information comes from that helps inform some of these decisions that they've been talking about tonight. So all that being said, the Conservation District is looking, we are actively engaged in trying to create a water bank. And so you might say, well, shoot, what's a water bank? Sounds like a great place. Can I get along? That's kind of what it's about. So next slide, please. So as we know, and as we talked about, many of our basins throughout Washington State are over allocated or are allocated to the amount of water that we can reasonably expect that we're going to see in any given year. New water rights are extremely hard to come by. The availability of water is maybe a little bit more tenuous in certain basins and from year to year. And so we have in-stream flow rules that say at a certain point, at a certain flow when it drops down, some irrigators will have to stop irrigating, for example, and other water users have to curtail their use in some fashion. And so a water bank is a way for an entity like the Conservation District to acquire one or more water rights, if you will, seed the bank, just like you're going to open up a savings account. You got to go in with some money to make a deposit to create the account. So you create a water bank by acquiring a water right, usually in the headwaters of the basin, as far up in the watershed as you can. And then you use that water right to seed many uses, okay? So an individual irrigator, for example, could sell a part or all of their water right to one other irrigator. And there's already a system in place. There's process in place for that, to be done. And it's, it works. A water bank is a little bit more effective way to take a single water right and make it available to multiple users in whole or in part. So a water bank, for example, can acquire one or more water rights in a headwaters or near the headwaters, say, for example, between here and Mazama, up the Chewok, that kind of thing. And if there are junior water right holders or communities or other users of water that might see curtailment in a low flow year, they could request a portion of water from the water right to make them whole. To allow them to continue to operate in those low flow or drought years. So that's really what the water bank is trying to drive at. One of the things, and it was mentioned earlier, the difference between the snowpack at up high in the mountains to what we have down low is definitely a we see differences in what is available. The lower elevations are seeing we're seeing less snow. That's my interpretation. That is not a scientific thing. I'm like John. I talk about science. I'm not a scientist, but it is those factors. What we're seeing, particularly for irrigators, are facing is it's more difficult for them to start the season with a full soil profile of water because they're not getting that water in the late season to fill it up at the end of the irrigation season, either rain or snow, things like that, and so they're playing catch up. And so some of them are looking to try to augment their water supply through other sources. So next slide. Okay. So like I said, water banks take a single water user or water right and then make portions of that available to others. It's done through what are called mitigation certificates. You can't do anything special with the water, like take an ag water right and make it year round without doing something else with it to make it a year round right. That would be through storage, like in a reservoir or an aquifer storage recharge system, things like that. You have to do something with it. I think a lot of people think that a water bank can take an agricultural water right here and make it, a municipal water right over here. And you can't do that. That's you're talking apples and oranges there. But you can take the water right from one similar use and make it available to several other similar uses. And it has to be downstream. So when you acquire that water right or multiple water rights, you develop suitability maps that show, okay, a water right that is acquired, say here in Winthrop, would not be available in Mazama. It can't go upstream. As much as we would like to administratively say, hey, let's take this up there, we can't do that. So what we do is we show, okay, we can show where this water right might be able to be used within a certain zone of influence, if you will, of the Methow River as it moves downstream, down the valley towards the terrace and beyond. We wouldn't, for example, again, take that same water right in Winthrop or Twisp and make it available up the Twisp River. Again, you can't force that water upstream. It has to go downstream. And so when those water rights are acquired, the district working with people that are scientists will show what that suitability area is. And we'll be able to then offer that water right, again, in whole or in part, to multiple users within those areas. We anticipate that the majority of the users for us is going to be other irrigators to be able to maintain some agricultural viability, so that when they are getting shut off in drought years, maybe this way they won't have to. So the other thing, final thing, is that water rights that are put into a water bank are protected from relinquishment. So water rights, if they're not used for 5 continuous years, and if they don't meet one of the state statutes, very specific exemptions for relinquishment, after 5 years, it's lost. You're not allowed to use that water right anymore. And so, so one of the things that a water bank helps provide is protection against that relinquishment. So once the water right is put into the bank, it's protected in perpetuity. So if, for example, we give that water right, we give a mitigation certificate to another user downstream, and it's a 10-year lease. They're going to use that water each year for 10 years, but after year 2, they stop using it. The bank doesn't lose that water right. We can still make that available for somebody else because it's been staying in stream. It's still there. It allows us under state statute to then, recoup that water right back and make it available to somebody else, even if they didn't use it for 5 of those years. So next slide. Okay. way more notes than I had time to go through. That's okay. All right, so the Conservation District is working, like I said, to create a water bank. There was a funding proviso in the state budget 2 years ago to the Department of Ecology to create a water banking program statewide. That funding proviso, it was funded $14 million. $2 million was specifically allocated to the Methow Basin. Because legislators knew there was a lot of interest in creating a water bank here locally. And so they said, okay, there's 14 million available, 2 million has to is dedicated just to the Methow Valley. So the Department of Ecology created that program, and they started taking applications about a year ago. The Conservation District, in order to, like I said, in order to create a water bank, you have to have a water right available. And so we've not actually purchased the water right. We have an agreement to purchase, depending on the appraisal. And we put in an application to purchase water right to seed the bank, to create the bank. The grant was awarded in November, and we're waiting on the grant contract. So we can't spend money on it yet. So we're still waiting to actually acquire the water rights. It's a very complex process. I'm not going to get into it tonight. I'm happy to answer questions later, but the idea is that we will acquire, it's an agricultural water right, so it will be available for other agricultural users. And the idea is that we will acquire it. We are hoping to acquire, there's another one that we're just starting now on a grant application to acquire it, that a second one that's also here in the Twist Winthrop area. And those will seed the water bank to make those water rights available down the road. We are working in partnership with Okanogan County, and the Watershed Council has been asking us questions and providing input all along the way, and helping us kind of figure out this process a little bit. It's completely new to all of us. Water banking has been done in other places in the state of Washington, but each one is a little bit different. Most of the other places where water banks have been done have storage options. So they have a little bit more variability of what they can do with water rights. We don't have that. Our storage is the snow in the mountains, pretty much. And so trying to figure out how exactly this will operate. The county is hoping to be able to make water available for non-agricultural users, so domestic homes, municipalities, industrial uses, things like that. Conservation District is focused on making water available for other ag users, maintaining ag viability, and keeping the water in our communities in the watershed of origin. So if it's water, that's, for example, in the Twist watershed, we want to try and make sure that it stays in the Twist or at least in the Methow watershed. So that's our goal. So next slide. I think that's it. I went through it really super fast, and I shouldn't have had that cup of coffee. I knew I shouldn't have. So happy to answer any questions, or we can pass on to the next speaker. So
yeah, I want to read just one question
Okay.
from the chat, and then we'll hear briefly from the Watershed Council, and then we'll wrap up. Can a 5,000 exempt well put water in the water bank?
Oh, that is a really good question. I'll have to find out. I don't think so, because it has to be a certificated right. So I'm pretty sure it has to be a certificated right, and an exempt well would not.
That's correct.
Hey, look at that. I got it. That's correct. Awesome. It's always nice to get affirmation in public. That is a really wonderful thing.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Oh, thanks so much.
Yeah.
Oh,
One question. One quick question. Yeah.
Do you lose a certain portion of the right and it's put in the bank?
Excellent question. So yes. Well, yes and no. It depends on how you acquire the water right. The funding proviso from the Department of Ecology has funding for 1/3 of that water right that is acquired has to go to in-stream flows in perpetuity. So if you buy, 30 acre feet of water, 10 of acre feet of water has to go into in-stream flow, and then 20 can be made available to other users.
So if you don't use a portion of that 2 million, you don't lose.
Oh, well, the money right now is slated to go away June 30th. at the end of the state fiscal biennium. However, Department of Ecology requested that the funding be continued. The governor proposed to continue the funding. We're just waiting on the legislature to make a decision and then provide a proposed budget back to the governor. So, yeah.
Do you anticipate the financial part of this? So here's my question.
Yeah.
A person who has a water right, they want to put in the bank, is going to get some money for that, correct?
Yes.
Is that going to be competitive with the amount of money that they can get selling it on the private market?
Maybe, maybe not. So using public funds, we have to do an appraisal, and that's part of that. We have a letter of agreement from the landowner waiting on that appraisal to be done. If that appraisal is significantly lower than what could be provided on the private market, we may not be able to acquire it. It's up to that individual water right holder. They have to make that decision. Are they willing to maybe take a little bit less to sell to us versus getting more to sell to the private individual? So
I believe most ditches own the water. So I'm pretty sure that you can't, as an individual, bank your water. It's the ditches own the water, so you have to come at it from a group decision.
Well, I would argue with that. I know quite a few people who have individual adjudicated water rights on private land that are not part of ditches. And there's plenty.
Well,
of
that's
that, so.
true. But myself, for instance, I have a lot of water I'd love to bank, but I belong to a ditch, so I have to wait for the full ditch to decide.
Correct. Yeah, and that is absolutely one of the conversations. You know, is are you an individual water right holder? Do you actually own the water right, or are you part of a ditch where the ditch actually owns the water right? So, yeah.
Well, okay.
Cool.
We gotta move it on. So many good questions.
Yeah, so I'll just be really quickly wrapping up tonight. You know, we have the introduction to the drought framework for Washington State, you know, a discussion about how drought works from a physical point of view. We heard about one very valuable tool for helping manage drought. And I guess moving forward, the Watershed Council is kicking off a drought response planning project. Can you go to the next slide? And what we really want to do is help facilitate the community to engage in a process together to do problem solving, so that when the next drought happens, we collectively have ideas of what to do and how we're going to go about it, so we can be more prepared. And so that's this project's in the early stages. This meeting was it's part of that process of getting us all, you know, kind of educated up a little bit on what we mean when we say drought from different perspectives. And so we'll be working to help facilitate the water users, connecting them with resources. So the ditch companies, individual landowners, the towns, all the different people that use water, and helping connect with the NGOs, the state agencies. There's a lot of resources out there, conservation district, that kind of thing. So, can you just go back one? We have objectives. Sorry. So, our objectives are, first of all, just to network with all the different groups and get everyone talking to each other, right? And also, you know, develop a list of things that we can do. There are questions about what can you do? There are the emergency wells, there are the water banking, water rights, and sometimes there can be emergency temporary leases, you know, so that junior users might need a temporary lease of a water right in order to continue on. Some other things that can be done are, you know, maybe curtail a third crop, conservation measures. So, you know, we want to be facilitating the community to help identify the list of what can we do, and so that we can be ready, you know, when a drought emergency is declared, to go ahead. So we'd like to have that agreed ahead of time. Can you go to the next? Thank you. And so as part of that, we'll be facilitating some vulnerability assessments in the community to get people, again, talking about this hardship piece, you know, and taking a look at the data, the rights, you know, who's going to be most affected, you know, which people, which animals, which fish, which areas, which ditch companies, which, water irrigate, which irrigators and farmers are going to be most affected. So that's the vulnerability assessment. It's, where's it going to be hardest hit, and I'm sure people here have stories about past droughts. Have people here been through past droughts and had to respond to it, change their activities? Anyone here want to raise your hand if you've been through some of the droughts? Yeah. Anyway, yeah. So we want to, get people together, talking about that, looking at the data, and coming up with this list. And it's not going to be a giant plan. It's going to be more kind of concrete things. And the Watershed Council we don't have rights to any of the water. So that's why we're helping facilitate and connect people and get us going forward on this. And we'll be working with ecology and the other agencies. So this will be a work in progress, and it's still in the early stages. And, we hope to bring all of you along, as part of the process, as well as other people too. So spread the word in the community. And you want to go to the next slide? And if you'd like to get involved, you can put your name on the sign up list at the back, or email Sarah at this, and we'll keep you in the loop on the next steps. And one of the next things that we're going to do is have another meeting like this that's kind of a water 101. And we're going to have a water lawyer come in, Natalie Cooler, and kind of give an update. There have been a lot of recent changes in the regulations, the laws, the rulings, subdivision ordinance, the Rawson ruling, all that stuff, and just go over where we are legally in terms of water in the valley. I know there's been a lot of questions about that. And then we'll have kind of, Greg's going to give a kind of a water 101 from the physical water part of our valley, our valleys here, and kind of how the water works here. So, the wet water and the paper water, kind of like tonight, the paper drought and the water drought, and then what can we do about it? So I just wanted to thank everybody for coming, and I guess we can open it up for more questions and discussion at this point. Any other words from my fellow Watershed Council people at this point? Okay, I'm sorry.
I just had a question about the original water users in the valley here.
Yes.
I haven't heard anything about fish, other vertebrates and invertebrates that use the river and have forever, even for the indigenous peoples. And maybe this question, maybe could go to Craig, but when there are a lot of rivers in the west that get dewatered by agricultural uses, is that a risk at all for the Methow? And I want a corollary question: how much water is necessary in the river, minimal stream flows, to sustain fisheries and the other users of the river?
That question was directed.
Well, I'm under the should I change the oil on the bus there, Derek? No, that's okay. So I will do my best to answer several very good questions. Could the Methow River be dried out by irrigation? Theoretically, yes. I think there are many protections against that. One being minimum in-stream flows. So then certain users, like I said, get curtailed. They're not allowed to water. And there are other things that there are already water rights that have been acquired to put into in-stream flows in perpetuity. So with that, there are a lot of entities, USGS, the Department of Ecology, and others that monitor and watch stream flows. And then, as they get worse and worse, if you will, theoretically, there are more actions that can be taken by individual users and the community. And that's where, like what John was talking about with some of the drought declarations, more and more resources become available to be used. And it could be, acquisition of or paying water right holders to not water their final cutting of hay, for example, to keep water in stream. That's a pretty common practice in drought years for basins like ours. You know, there's potential for other actions as well. We're just, I think we're in the relative infancy of learning how to mitigate for drought. I mean, there are certain tools that yes, we know how to do. I think we have to be a little bit better on predicting, will we be in a drought situation this year or not? Sometimes those decisions get delayed till April, May, June. You know, I mean, the irrigators may already be starting to irrigate, and if we can get a better decision matrix on whether we're in drought or not, then there are more options earlier in the season than later in the season for trying to maintain flow in spring. So I think I answered that question, but I think you had one other, and I apologize.
Okay.
I talked too long now. See, I talked really fast earlier, and now I talked really long. But yeah.
Do senior water rights holders, do they need to give up their water rights at any point for stream flows?
There's no legal mechanism to make them do that I'm aware of. Maybe John, okay, I'm giving a head shake no. So yeah, if they are senior to the in-stream flow rule, then yeah, if there's water there, they can pump it.
And the other question was, has anybody looked at what the minimum water flows are to preserve fisheries and other native users of water? Like if it, you know, there could be a big difference between 120 CFS and 150 CFS.
Mm-hmm.
And what kind of fish kills you're going to see, and the water temperatures, and how it lakes climate at the time that those low flows occur. Has anybody set them?
Yeah, now I'm going to invite Greg back under the bus with me.
And the answer is yes, and talking afterwards of any number of papers and studies, including modeling and so forth, have been conducted by both the state and federal agencies, including officials, that try and arrive at that answer. It's not a precise definition, but yes, it has been.
Questions there? Okay. And then we should wrap up. Yeah.
My understanding is the minimum entry flows are mostly not met in the winter time and not as much during the irrigation. Because in the winter time it's all locked up in the snow. So I mean, I feel like right now I can almost walk across the river.
I was interested in Chris's graph that showed that no matter how high the peak was, you always came back to the same basement. And I think it's a question that's open to debate, but there is the easiest way to put it is yes, there is less water in the winter. Now, the other question that goes into that is, are the fish there that need it at that point? That is a question that's difficult to snorkel.
So we're going to take one more question here, and then we have two online, and then people are free to stay afterwards and talk.
So I'm assuming this, but I don't want to just walk away assuming this. If I bank water, if I'm up the Twist River and I bank water, that water can be used by somebody down in Methow.
Yes.
Correct?
Yes.
Okay. As long as it's downstream.
As a general rule, yes. Yeah.
And if I bank water, can I buy it back?
Yes. That, in fact, that is one of the things we are looking at, is particularly for folks that are, say, getting close to farming retirement, if you will. They're not 100% sure what they want to do going forward. Is the idea of possibly acquiring that water right and then, you know, leasing it back through a mitigation certificate and saying, yeah, you can continue to use this for the next, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, whatever it is. But then that also then ensures that water is protected from relinquishment if you suddenly decide to retire next year and not come back to it and you haven't sold the property or anything.
I think Nigel, our water master, has an answer for that.
Yeah, and there's also a mechanism where you can temporarily lead to our trust, to the state trust. And so that's a way to protect it from relinquishment for short periods of time.
So we have two questions.
Yep, there's two questions on the chat.
We're just going to take two more questions from the chat and then adjourn, and people can stay and talk later. So do you want to read them?
Sure. Yep. They sound like they might be for Christopher. Thinking about interannual drought, what are the long-term cycles that have been observed?
So we don't have a lot of information about that, so I think the plot I was showing goes back 30 years, and we've seen kind of, one kind of pretty significant, so yes, I think maybe we can kind of expect that at that kind of frequency.
Okay, and then the second question is, what data is used when considering how many more wells can be drilled and how deep?
Any takers on that one?
I'm not sure who that- Looks like we have one more question in the back. Okay, so that's a tough question.
Well, let's give an answer to that. So there are a number of new rulings that affect sorry, I didn't just realize that's kind of on the camera here. That affect how many more wells can be drilled. And that will be part of the topic of our next session, because it's complicated, and the depth, there's nothing that constrains the depth of your well. But there are a lot of rulings and regulations that affect that. It has to do with the water availability, and our water rights lawyer will be going into that in detail. I think the session will be in May. We don't have the date established yet, but yeah.
Time for one more?
Anything else? No.
One more? No.
I just wanted to plug the, what Craig had already spoken to that about as something to use the water bank for the county side of interest in, if there is a cap at some point, if you can find a right to acquire to mitigate for another well to be drilled, 10 wells to be drilled, but with the caveats, the complications around ag seasonality and use, or low flow rule, and do the new uses with the new well, work within the rights that you have. It would still be a moving target even if we had that.
Yeah. It's not. Okay, well, I'm aware that, we've reached our time limit. So anyone that wants to stay and talk longer is welcome to. And thank you, everybody, very much for coming. Thank you to our presenters and organizers. I should have said.
Nice plug.
Yes, sir.